Regional Voices of Wartime Ukraine, presented by Ukrainian Crisis Media Center.
Surviving against all odds. The story of a family from Chornobayivka. Written by Alexandra Radova.
Foreign media is reporting less and less on Ukraine. The world appears to have grown accustomed to Russia's atrocities during its colonial war in this region. However, the aggression continues, and millions of people must literally survive each day, if not under Russian occupation, then under Russian bombs. In the early months of the full-scale war, the village of Chornobayivka in the Kherson region rose to international prominence after Ukrainian forces repeatedly destroyed enemy troops and equipment there. Despite their formidable reputation, the locals are ordinary people who the occupiers have not abandoned, even after this part of Kherson was liberated. Listen to the story of a family that, despite being in grave danger, remains at home and believes in the victory of freedom and truth over tyranny and lies.
The Kononenko family, Irina, 66, and Alexander, 68, were in their home village of Chornobayivka, a suburb of Kherson, when the full-scale war broke out. On February 24, a large explosion nearby woke the woman up at dawn, as it did for millions of other Ukrainians. The huge shockwave caused the garage and house doors to slam open. Irina felt a pang in her chest from fear. However, there was no one to console her. Her husband had been hospitalized a few days prior, and her adult children lived separately. She ran outside wearing a jacket over her nightgown. Black, thick smoke billowed over the airport on the outskirts of Chornobayivka. It became extremely alarming. Neighbors whispered, "The war has begun." The Kherson region could immediately sense what it was like. The road that separates Chornobayivka into two sections roared with heavy Russian military vehicles. The columns of enemy tanks, armored personnel carriers, and trucks were never ending. They roared all day and night. Some heavy vehicles entered the airport while the rest continued on to Mykolaiv. Alexander didn't have time to get his heart treated. He left the hospital like the other patients with no hope of receiving medical care. The following day, February 25th, intense explosions began. The Kononenko's house had all of its windows and frames blown out in the middle of the night. The electricity went out at once. It was a windy night, and without windows, the house immediately became cold. The day began by looking for a plastic sheet to cover up the holes. Alexander remembered the old wooden windows that existed before the repairs. They set them up. Then they started preparing the basement to stay in during shelling. Despite its cramped, cold, and damp conditions, it provided an escape for them, their friends, and neighbors from almost daily shelling throughout the war. Chornobayivka became world famous. The Russians brought military equipment to the airport from the Dnipro's left bank, which the Ukrainian military had occupiers destroyed nearly 30 times, if not more. When the Ukrainian military received equipment and ammunition, someone in Chornobayivka notified them. There was a lot of good stuff there, so the Ukrainians were constantly hitting there. Then all of that good stuff exploded. Black mushrooms rose above the village. Everything roared, whistled, squealed, and signal rockets flew in various colors. It went on for hours and hours on end. That's how many weapons the Russians brought here to kill us. Could barely survive that time in the basement, said the Kononenkos. In the early days, villagers reported hearing shots in the steppes and near the airport. Enemy vehicles were moving to and from Kherson. Then they occupied a farm and installed an air defense system there. They dug in. Every day, something would shoot. Perhaps the Russians received some training. They didn't care about Chornobayivka. Instead, they targeted Mykolaiv. Later, when our military began to beat them here, they staged provocations, launching missiles from the airport straight into the village. Then they started shooting them down over the houses. The Grad's missile heads landed in people's yards and houses. One fell on the Kononenko's neighbor's house, and other neighbors were also affected. Alexander and Irina couldn't see where the missiles were shot down because they had to rush for cover. After Irina went into the basement, the husband was further away in the yard, so he had to run from the gate to the garage. When he arrived at the garage, he discovered that there was a car filled with petrol. He dashed up and closed the gate, hoping to deflect some of the debris. As soon as he managed to flee, a cluster missile struck the area and began to explode. The man collapsed to the ground, and the missile components flew in all directions. In each cartridge, a number of small balls exploded with incredible speed and force. It first exploded above their house, then in the neighbor's garden, and finally down the street. It was terrifying to see it hit the neighbors' roofs and tear through ceilings and walls. Fortunately, the man was not injured. Irina was nearly deaf in one ear. When the shelling stopped, a neighbor yelled, "Help! My house is ruined!" The Kononenkos ran out into the street and heard another neighbor yell, "The pipe is broken! Gas is leaking!" Alexander went straight to the garage, grabbed the tools, and dashed to the neighbor's house to turn off the gas valve. He was on time. The shelling also caused damage to the Kononenkos' home, with shrapnel cutting through the roof and turning it into, well, essentially a sieve. The side of the roof was severely damaged with almost nothing left of it. Alexander barely had time to patch the hole with an old piece of linoleum when a downpour began. There was one time the man actually witnessed a missile explode, dangerously close, almost above his head, and he stopped and couldn't move. It was as if the fight, flight, or freeze psychological factor had been triggered. He wanted to run and hide, but his legs were stuck. The Russians repeatedly fired on Chornobayivka. They're still doing it, regularly. There is little rest, especially at night. You're not sure whether to sleep or not, because the shelling begins as soon as it gets dark. It's close, loud, and terrifying. We've forgotten what a nightgown and pajamas are because we sleep dressed to be able to quickly get back into the basement when it gets extremely close. And then there's no peace in the day either. They start bombarding the town and you are unable to get those necessary naps in, says Irina. Since the beginning of the war, the Kononenkos' neighbors have paid them overnight visits. Some people were afraid to stay in their homes as others' homes were completely destroyed or severely damaged. Not everyone had basements fit for shelter. 2 older neighbors of a pensioner age and a young woman with a schoolgirl arrived at the Kononenkos, the child screaming, terrified of the explosions, and couldn't be calmed down. The Russians had actively dug in on the outskirts of Chornobayivka. They also installed a crematorium there. For a time, the odor of burning human bodies persisted almost every day. The locals claimed that they burned their people's corpses rather than taking them home. And perhaps our fellow citizens as well, seeing as people went missing and have yet to be found. Irina and Alexander were especially afraid to go out at first because they had no idea how a simple trip to a store for bread would turn out. They were also concerned about being seen by the Russian barbarians. I know people who died simply because they were walking down the street even though there was no curfew. Going out during the curfew, which began at 5 p.m., meant certain death. A man decided to walk his dog in the evening and was fatally shot right outside his home. In general, the Russians in Chornobayivka seemed to be calm, but in the evening it was impossible to go out. They would get drunk, walk the streets, and shoot at fences just for the fun of it, adds Irina. Once she was walking down the street in a hurry one time, an enemy tank pointed its muzzle at her. The woman asked whether she could pass. "Yes, you may," said a young Buryat. "We're protecting you." Another time she was working outside. She hardly had time to hide from the shelling. A moment later, a bullet flew past her. She told of multiple stories of tragedy that occur almost daily. In the winter of 2023, in the very center of the village, Irina came under heavy fire. The thumping was so intense that spruce branches were flying. I and other passersby slipped and fell on the wet, dirty asphalt, which was pressed into the ground. It flew above us and close enough that we were already saying our goodbyes to life. We got up, ran, and it exploded again, and we crashed into the puddles. We were trembling and terrified from what we were going through and no longer had the strength to stand up and run. It was a miracle that nobody was hurt or killed. Of course, living under occupation was difficult not only because of the constant threat, but also due to the humanitarian crisis. From the beginning of the war, a large number of Russian soldiers appeared in the village. They drove around in tanks, robbed grocery stores, smashed the ATB supermarket, and spent a week removing all of the food. They robbed everything like hell. They also ransacked private residences. They weren't ashamed of anything, and they didn't avoid anything, the Kononenkos say. There was only one shop in the village that sold bread. The queues there were so long that you had to wait half a day to get something. You could only get 2 loaves of bread per person. Any more and you'd need yeast to make your own. However, there was nowhere to buy it. Prices for all food and household goods skyrocketed, and many items simply vanished from store shelves. Initially, you could pay by card and cash while the internet was available, and then only in cash. The occupiers started using Russian rubles, issuing Russian passports, and encouraging people to get pensions in rubles. The Kononenkos refused outright. Unfortunately, they were forced to accept a Russian pension due to a lack of Ukrainian currency and out-of-order ATMs. Young people had no money and could only rely on their families' pensions. Throughout the summer, Irina canned vegetables, fruits, and berries that she grew in her garden or could purchase. The couple attempted to make at least some supplies because they had no idea how long they would have to live under the muzzles of Russian tanks, how much money they would have to buy food, or whether there would be any food. Ukrainian humanitarian aid did not arrive because the Russians blocked it. Instead, the occupiers began to distribute humanitarian aid. The people of Chornobayivka also demonstrated their character here. When Irina was waiting in line at the store to buy bread, the Russians brought buckwheat and oil and began inviting people, but nobody approached. They then unloaded their goods onto the ground and left. The villagers took the buckwheat out of the sacks, poured oil on it, and set it on fire. Everyone stood quietly, watching the Russian gifts burn. In the autumn, the occupiers held a referendum on Kherson's accession to Russia. Armed soldiers went to people's homes and collected their signatures. It meant that Chornobayivka residents had to express their independent position at gunpoint. It was really scary, but my husband and I stated unequivocally against. We waited with bated breath, wondering how our uninvited guests would react. They stared at us, wrote our names on a separate list, and then stormed out. For several days we were expecting a problem, that they would return and take us to the torture chamber. Fortunately, it did not happen. However, they came with searches for another reason. They wanted our daughter. Of course, nobody explained why. When they couldn't find her, she didn't live with us. They threatened to go after her wherever she was. Oh, we were so concerned then, Irina recalls. For almost the past 3 years, the family has been in danger due to the war. But they don't want to leave because their home, family, elderly parents and friends and jobs are all here. They continue to live in their house, which is torn apart by debris protruding from the walls and the bullets that pass through the gate. The fighting never stops. On November 11, 2022, Ukrainians retook Kherson. Battles raged in nearby Kyselivka. The Russians realized Ukraine was advancing and began to leave. People in Chornobayivka learned about the deoccupation when they heard Ukraine's national anthem playing. They immediately ran outside, began to cry, picked flowers that were blooming in the gardens at the time, ran, carried food, tea, canned food, hugged, thanked, and everyone was sobbing, both men and women. The occupation brought relief, and people could relax. However, the difficulties did not end there. The Russians destroyed communications. As soon as utilities were repaired, the invaders would cut them off again. We had no electricity and no water for 2 months, and there were problems with phone service. We used to go to the village council to recharge our phones, call our families, and get water. The worst part, however, was the Russians' shelling of Kherson and Chornobayivka from the Dniepro's left bank. What cynicism! When they entered Kherson, they claimed we were their brothers and that they were there to protect us. But when they lost the city, they began to mercilessly destroy it as well as us. Daily. Alexander Kononenko explains that not only were grads and mortars used, but also banned phosphorus bombs that set everything on fire. It's impossible to relax. Irina and Alexander, like the rest of the villagers, wake up early and have no idea what the day will bring. There is no sleep or peace. We've aged 10 years since the occupation. We've cried and gone through so much that we've never seen anything like this in our lives, Irina says. However, Irina wipes away her tears and returns each day to weaving camouflage nets. For over 6 months, she has been baking 200 pies per day to distribute to Ukrainian soldiers. She prays, helps others, including her husband, and is confident that we will be able to drive this insidious and cruel enemy from our land.
Supported by the U.S. Embassy in Ukraine, the views of the authors don't necessarily reflect the official position of the U.S. government.